They're going to be written, and then I'll read them back to you or summarize them, and we'll go
Okay,
from there.
sounds good.
All right, and
We
I'm
do
going to let
that.
people in right now.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rebecca Hurst. I'm the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. We're a research and action institute focused on ensuring that historically excluded populations and people and communities are able to thrive in our changing climate. And I'm here tonight as a representative of UMass Boston. I'm so excited to welcome you all to the Living on Earth Book Club with Richard Powers. It's been a real pleasure to partner with Living on Earth and with Steve and his team on these book clubs. And I'm really excited to welcome you all to this conversation today. So thank you all so much for joining us. And with that, I will hand it over to Steve.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, it's great to be working with the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston, where there are many fascinating things going on, and I'm sure we'll be partnering on more sessions as the year goes forward. And let me welcome you in the audience to this, our jump off meeting of the Living on Earth Book Club. I should say that this is our first event of fall 2021. My name is Steve Kerwood. I'm the host of the radio program and podcast Living on Earth. And we've been doing this every week since 1991. That makes it 30 years. And so this season, we're kicking off with a guest that some call our greatest living novelist. Richard Powers won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for his 2018 novel, The Over Story. It's a sweeping exploration of our relationship with nature and the people who fight to save it, and the personalities of our trees. And tonight, I'm thrilled to talk to him about his new novel called Bewilderment that picks up on that theme, but at a much more intimate scale. Now, let me just point out that we can't host these free events without your support. And thanks to a generous offer from the publisher W.W. Norton, we'll send the first 20 people who donate $75 or more tonight a signed copy of Richard's book. Now, and also, just so you know, if you'd like to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom, or if you're joining us on Facebook Live, please comment with your questions. So, let's get started. Richard Powers, welcome to Living on Earth.
Thanks so much, Steve. Looking forward to this.
Well, as we are as well. So let me, let's see, I pushed the wrong button here. I don't want to disappear on our audience there. Okay, what's your inspiration for this novel? What gave you the big idea that turned into these wonderful words?
You know, it's been my experience that novels start like rivers in several tiny little tributaries that come together rather than one big trigger that sets everything off. And often, when you go back and try to tell the story and narrate it in a clean way, you make it sound as if there was one proximal trigger. But I do think that these things accrete over long periods of time. In this case, for instance, I can trace this book back, the starting points for various aspects of the story 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 20 years ago, and ultimately about 55 years ago. So I'll just start by saying in 2013, I came across a description of a new kind of emerging psychotherapy called decoded neurofeedback. The technique has been around for a little bit more than a decade. The first research and result papers were coming out starting around 2010, 2011. And it's a very captivating technique. Essentially, one person is scanned using fMRI, imaged in real time while they're learning a task or engaged in an activity or cultivating an emotional state. And that scan, that real-time scan, is saved down as a data structure and used as a template for a second person who's also subsequently being scanned in real time, and then given cues based on an analysis of their own brain states as to how close or far they are from the template. Almost like the game of blind man's bluff, where you're saying, warmer, warmer, colder, colder, and the trainee, if you will, learns how to put themselves in a state that resembles the target state, the pre-recorded target state. When I read about this 8 years ago, I just, it seemed like a science fiction story to me. It seemed like the genesis of a technology that could, down the road, be something like a crash course in guided telepathy or a training in raising your emotional intelligence. And when I had that thought, I immediately remembered a story that I read as a kid called Flowers for Algernon, which is a classic science fiction story from way back in the day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In that story, there is a kind of science fiction intervention that allows a person to have an enormous rapid increase of their cognitive intelligence. And I just thought this would be a similar kind of story, but for the emotions, for self-possession, robustness, and rich emotional empathy. And in fact, I began to think of decoded neurofeedback as a kind of empathy machine. I went back and hunted down that Daniel Key story, his story originally, and then turned into a novel later on. And I saw that in his epigraph, he uses some lines from Plato's Cave, from the allegory of the cave, from the Republic. And the line is something like, the mind, like the eye, knows two kinds of bewilderment. One going into the light and one coming out of it. And of course, in Plato's cave, we're all kind of chained in darkness, looking at this shadow show and mistaking it for reality. One of us escapes, goes outside, sees that actually there is a real world beyond, comes back in to try to tell us all. And of course, that doesn't go very well. But that idea that the mind, like the eye, has two kinds of bewilderment: escaping the cave and then having to go back into the cave. I thought that fits so beautifully for the possible narrative that you could spin out of someone going into this training. Well, the book changed quite a bit from my original conception, but decoded neurofeedback did remain a part of that story, a part of the engine that propels, in this case, a young boy, an intense, unusual, morally absolute 9-year-old kid to learn how to master some of the behavioral problems that he is demonstrating at the beginning of the story. But of course, nothing is ever so simple, and one thing leads to another, and pretty soon you have a drama.
By the way, the crew is saying that we're getting some strange scratching. So I'm gonna have you just unplug your earbuds and just talk to the computer and see if that gets rid of this sort of unhappy, scratchy sound. Just say a couple of words.
Better?
I think people will find that better. Okay, this
good.
is great. Now, by the way, of course, in your own professional background, way back in the day, you looked at neurology. And I'm sure that this helped you think a little bit about this. I mean, it's way outside of the box that you looked at back in the day, but
I never studied it in school. It was an interest of mine. I did do this kind of novelist crash autodidactic full immersion several years ago for another novel that I was working on. And, you know, so in that regard, it was revisiting some old territory. However, I have to say, in Bewilderment, the role that the actual neurology underpinning this this technology plays is very small.
yeah,
There is a larger, I mean, it's almost it's a more traditional kind of science fiction use of a technology where you don't necessarily have to know the nuts and bolts of what's happening. It's there basically to propel the fabulistic element of the narrative. There is, however, a science strain in the book that does become a little more integrated into the main story, and the main story is about this troubled 9-year-old and his father, who's in his late 30s, who is an astrobiologist. And it's his father, Theo's field, astrobiology, that actually does get folded back into this personal narrative between the father and the son, in a little bit more depth, I think. So that's the powers part of this novel, the science part of this novel.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and of course you have great fun, you know, stating the classic. You know, either we're completely alone, or there must be many of us.
Yeah.
Although, actually, I think Enrico Fermi talked about this. Actually, though, the fact that we are here means that there must be more of us.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we wouldn't be here at all.
There's a famous story about Fermi. I think he out in Los Alamos in the early 50s, maybe 54, I think. And they were having lunch in the cafeteria, and other colleagues of his were talking about, you know, the revolutions in astronomy that were showing that the universe is probably a good deal older and a good deal larger than previously thought, which you know, Fermi thought about for a while. And when he had sort of crunched the numbers a bit, he stopped and said, "Then where is everybody?" And this has come to be called the Fermi paradox.
Right.
The numbers are sobering. I mean, the universe is 3 times older than the Earth. There are 100 billion galaxies or more. Each of those galaxies has 100 billion, on the order of 100 billion or more stars. And we now know that each of those stars is likely to have 1 or more planets. That's a lot of real estate and a lot of time. And, you know, it seems logical that we ought to be able to look up in all of that expanse, you know, having unfolded for all of that length of time, and see some evidence of somebody else out there. But even with this great explosion of our ability to look and get fine details from very, very far away, this explosion of data over the last couple of decades, we are still confronted with what the people who think about the Fermi paradox call the great silence. So
Well,
yeah,
yes, but isn't it a little bit arrogant though for us humans to think that we would even know about all of this? I when I reflect on this, I think of, bees. They're greatly organized in a social colony, and yet a bee would have no idea about this technology that you and I are using to talk to each other now, computers and all that.
right.
So so just because we don't get it as humans, maybe this all this connection is way above our pay grade, Richard.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah. Well,
um
there
so
there are there are two aspects to the Fermi paradox. Uh, One is the one that we leap immediately to, which is where are the intelligent uh, uh, civilizations, and why aren't we getting signals? Why don't we see von Neumann replicating machines flying around the solar system? Why don't we see Dyson spheres, advanced civilizations that have created, turned their stars into, completely efficient solar cells? Well, that's one question. And certainly the search for intelligent life is always going to get the headlines. But astrobiology as a discipline, and it's still a very young discipline, is probably more concerned with this larger question of life in aggregate. What are its affordances? What are its capacities? How easy or difficult is abiogenesis, the beginning of life on a planet? What are the ranges of tolerance of life? And the discovery of extremophiles on Earth has greatly broadened that envelope. So what Theo is looking for in the story is not intelligent life. He is developing computer models to do spectroscopy on the light coming through a planet's atmosphere, and looking at those spectroscopic spectra,
right.
looking for the fingerprints, the biosignatures for kinds of life that are probably microbial. They may be like ours, but they may have different kinds of chemical metabolic pathways. In just looking at every possible way that we would be able to look at an atmosphere and say, that planet is no longer restricted to merely physics and chemistry. That planet is alive. It has a biosphere. And that would be a revolution, for us to discover that would be a milestone in terrestrial human history. And it would change the way that we think about ourselves, even if it were only microbial life.
Right. That's right. And that's so amazing about your science fiction, because it's so close to the real thing. I mean, like right now, for example, on Mars, we have this rover that's looking for
Yeah.
evidence of microbial life
Yeah.
back at the beginning of our solar system. What was going on 3 billion years ago. And but Richard, talk to me about your characters. You have Theo, his son Robin, which I have to be careful not to spoil anything, because you have, the narrative, the story of this is really quite amazing as well. I mean, you really draw us in tight and give us a ride that at every twist and turn yanks on the heart. I mean, so I'm not gonna, but people need to enjoy that. But Robin is 9, which you picked a person who hits just right that sweet spot of latency, right?
Mhm.
They're
Yeah.
really able to reason. The hormones haven't driven them crazy yet.
There's
And
still a tenderness and a vulnerability of early childhood, and they're just about to go into that tumult of pre-adolescence.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I think it's okay to say that Theo, the astrobiologist, is with his son Robin, um, because their mother has died, and I'll leave those details out. But I think it might be really helpful if you could read to us from the very opening of your book.
Sure.
It's the page and a half, from the first words on page 1, and then just to end up at the line where you say, "Can we sleep outside tonight, Dad?"
Okay. So I'm not going to set this up at all, because they are the very first lines of the book. and if you have to set up your first page, you've got some problems. But we might never find them. We'd set up the scope on the deck on a clear autumn night, on the edge of one of the last patches of darkness in the eastern United States. Darkness this good was hard to come by, and so much darkness in one place lit up the sky. We pointed the tube through a gap in the trees above our rented cabin. Robin pulled his eye from the eyepiece. My sad, singular, newly turning 9-year-old in trouble with this world. Exactly right, I said. We might never find them. I always tried to tell him the truth, if I knew it, and if it wasn't lethal. He knew when I lied anyway. But they're all over, right? You guys have proved it. Well, not exactly proved. Maybe they're too far away, too much empty space or something. His arms pinwheeled as they did when words defeated him. We were closing in on bedtime, which didn't help. I put my hand on his wild auburn mop, her color, Allie's. And what if we never heard a peep from out there? What would that say? He held up one hand. Alyssa used to say that when he concentrated, you could hear him whirring. His eyes narrowed, staring down into the dark ravine of trees below. His other hand sawed at the cleft of his chin, a habit he resorted to when thinking hard. He sawed with such vigor, I had to stop him. Robbie, hey, time to land. His palm pushed out to reassure me. He was fine. He simply wanted to run with the question for another minute into the darkness while still possible. If we never heard anything like ever, I nodded encouragement to my scientist. Easy does it. Stargazing was finished for tonight. We'd had the clearest evening in a place known for rain. A full hunter's moon hung fat and red on the horizon. Through the circle of trees, so sharp it seemed within easy reach, the Milky Way spilled out. Countless speckled placers in a black stream bed. If you held still, you could almost see the stars wheel. Nothing definitive, that's what. I laughed. He made me laugh once a day or more in good stretches. Such defiance, such radical skepticism. He was so me. He was so her. No, I agreed, nothing definitive. Now, if we did hear a peep, that would say tons. Indeed, there would be time enough another night to say exactly what. For now, it was bedtime. He put his eye up to the barrel of the telescope for a last look at the shining core of the Andromeda galaxy. Can we sleep outside tonight, Dad?
I'm not sure you actually had to read that. You know, of course, using the first person as the narrator here.
Right.
You know this. You know this. It's just fascinating.
Yeah. So yeah, here you have Theo and Robin in a nutshell. Robin's mother has died about 2 years before the start of the story, and Theo knows that he's in over his head. He doesn't know how to deal with this boy whose behavior is increasingly volatile. All he knows is that he loves the boy so much that he would do anything in his power to protect him from the world, but he doesn't know what that is, and he will not lie to the boy. And part of the trauma, of course, is personal. The loss of the mother at an early age, may be enough to account for, the wildest kind of behavior. But part, as the story goes on, is caused by Robin, who, like so many children, is kind of a pantheist or an animist, just sees the sacred in everything that's alive. E.O. Wilson's biophilia is still going full tilt in this boy. And he is beginning to learn about this mass extinction that we've leveled on the earth. And it's a reality so devastating to him that he turns his anger and confusion and hostility outwards onto his father and onto the humans around him.
What's your experience with children, by the way, Richard? Do you have your own? Are you close to someone this age?
I have a lot of experience having been a child, probably too much, too long. And I have many nieces and nephews, both, blood and by marriage. And I do not have children myself, but I feel as if on at least 3 occasions, I've had a kind of surrogate parent relationship to children who have been in trouble with the world in one way or another, or whose behavior has pushed them outside of the median on a normal distribution curve. And those were the kids that I was channeling when I tried to figure out who Robbie was and how he worked. And I have to confess that I think the deeper I got into creating Robbie, the more I realized that I was drawing on my own sense of difference as a child. So it was a process of self-discovery too for me to write the book.
Wow. So when did you discover that this planet we call home is really, in terms of the species that we know and love, including us, is in a lot of trouble?
Yeah. I asked myself that question, what age did I really become conscious of what kind of cataclysm we were facing down? And I do think that the first inklings, I was born in 1957. And so let me put that as one bookend on trying to locate my own childlike understanding of the environmental crisis. On the other end of that bookend, I'll put my second novel, where I actually address global warming and climate change for, fairly early on for American fiction. That novel appeared in 1988. And while the scientists, of course, had been trying to make the case and bring the reality in front of the American public for years before that, literary arts obviously were lagging in thinking of that or using it as a meaningful component of a narrative. I do remember the first Earth Day very vividly in 1970, and so I would have been 13. And I guess that's somewhere in that window, somewhere probably in my early teens. I began to take on that sense of dread that we all live with in one way or another, and we adults get very good at shunting it off and finding ways to will it away, but children don't do that. And I think that Robin's eco-trauma in Bewilderment is very representative, even though he may be a neurodivergent child. He may be not, part of the statistical mean, but that element of his sensibility, the real despair and the real bewilderment that he feels in the face of the diminishment of the earth, is very representative of young people. And everything from my anecdotal experience to very recent polling shows that we have an epidemic of eco-anxiety on the part of the young.
Indeed, in an upcoming broadcast, we have an interview with a psychiatrist, a practicing psychiatrist who's conducted interviews. You know, round number 75% of the kids, have this. So what's, again, without saying too much about what's in the book, what's amazing about your book, Richard, is that you go to the hardest thing about the ecological disaster we're facing by dealing with feelings, by going to the emotion. There's no recitation of facts here or sort of the cold reality of things. It's very much an exploration of feelings and how they work, how emotions work with us and among us, how they can even, in some senses, be shared. Wow, that's a pretty deep dive.
There was a line in my previous novel, The Overstory, all the best arguments in the world won't change a person's mind. The only thing that will do that is a good story. And I do think that reflects something about the way that our consciousness is structured. We have enormous capacity for empathy, for imagining ourselves into another person's life, but generally through this technique of storytelling and narrative. We identify with the character in a story and we say, who would I have to be to feel that way? And what would my life look like from that perspective? And all of these, these leaps of empathy that are driven by simply hearing, almost in a gossipy way, what's happening to other people in other places, in other lives. And I think this has been well demonstrated in the psychological, in the experimental psychological literature as well, that people change their worldviews, or they change their allegiance to convictions, not through being argued out of them, not through tables and graphs and charts, but through something, some invitation to imagine themselves in another circumstance, or through another lens or from another perspective. And once you do that, it's humbling. Your prior convictions have to give way, because you can reason yourself into another place. I mean, you can imagine yourself into another story, and needing, and once you put on temporarily somebody else's belief set, it becomes a whole lot easier to give it credence, credibility. And that's why this story is so devoid of the usual kinds of approaches to the climate crisis, to the extinction crisis. It's just the dad and his kid. And you can choose, as a reader, you can say, I remember being a child like that and being frightened, or being, believing in the sacredness of life, the more than human life. Or you can say, holy cow, that dad, he is in trouble, because you cannot turn away from a 9-year-old's question. And what would I say to that kid if the kid was asking me? And all of those acts of empathy, I think, are a kind of end around on getting the reader engaged again in a set of concerns that most of us have learned how to put the damper on.
So taking it deeper, when you started to create these characters and gave them, through a little bit of sci-fi, this fluency and emotional sharing, what did it change for you?
How did I change in the act of writing the book?
Yeah,
that's a good question. Wow. I wrote this book over a relatively short period of time during the pandemic. And there was a kind of psychotherapy for me in recreating myself, both as the son and as the father, and living these roads, lives not taken. And there was also a strange cathartic pleasure in trying to create a hypothetical Earth that looked a lot like the Earth that we were living through under the Trump administration, but diverged from it in some significant ways. So I was doing a simultaneous personal deep dive and attempted geopolitical allegory or fable, which I think was just simply therapy. You know, I cast yourself back a year and a half and think of how crazy it was day to day. What is going to happen? How far can we go? Where is this country going to land? And you know, hitting the refresh button on your news feed, you know, 3, 4, 5 times an hour or more. That was the world that you know that created this book. It's a short book, and as you said, it's entirely narrated by the father, and it's restricted to these 2 main characters. But it's a book that very intensely tries to grab something of the anxiety of the zeitgeist circa 2020.
Yeah, part of that zeitgeist is social media, or something that I'm more and more beginning to call anti-social media, towards the dark side.
Right. Have you seen that a lot of people are just starting to call it social? You know, they'll leave out the media and just say, you know, oh, I saw that on social.
Yeah,
Which is pretty scary.
as if it's real.
Right.
So again, without any spoilers here, to what extent was that a device, and to what extent does that reflect your feelings about what's going on in the way that we communicate these days?
Well, of course, during lockdown, I think that trend that had already been accelerating, that had us all disappearing into the virtual, was just kicked up, so, you know, an order of magnitude almost overnight, because that was, you know, for a lot of people, the only social contact that they had. And so I think some of the anxiety and part of the deranged quality of society that the book explores as social media explodes on this boy and turns him into an unwilling celebrity, was simply responding to the kind of claustrophobia of the moment, and you know, feeling that we were now kind of disappearing into this you know, this simulacrum of social interaction. On the other hand, you know, here we are returning to the face-to-face world, but I don't think those hours are going to be recuperated or retrieved anytime soon. I think, you know, we've established a way of living that's likely to be entrenched for quite some time.
For the better or for the worse, do you think?
In my broad view, there are enormous affordances for both of those in the ability to speak rapidly and robustly through different channels to lots of people, or to have different relationships with different numbers of people on either end of this. I mean, here we are, Steve, and you know, we have a nice, robust audience, and we get to talk about this book in a way that would not have been possible without this medium. But my larger preoccupation in Bewilderment is with something for which social media might be considered a symptom. And it is a cultural malady that I've taken to calling human exceptionalism. And you know, that's not my term. It's just a term that I've seen around, and it seems to be a good umbrella descriptor of this belief that we humans are somehow autonomous elements, and that the rest of the world is a resource for our program. And our program basically is to further our control and mastery over the physical world, over time and space, over all the limitations posed to our conscious will. And the rest of creation is almost immaterial. We are the only interesting game in town. And it's that vision of human separatism that the overstory challenges and that bewilderment challenges.
Thank God. Thank God. I mean, it's just like, whoa. I mean, do you hear this loud sucking sound pulling us down as we are so prideful and we think that we're the entire game? I mean, it just is, well, it's very, it's, as you write here, really, it's frightening at the end of the day. It's frightening.
Yeah, and
especially the way you confronted this in the overstory. It's just it's maddening and frightening and stupid, and I don't know. I could probably go on with the adjectives.
Yeah.
Well, so the question is, what's to be done? In other words, as a novelist, and Brian has posed this as in the audience has posed this as a question to us. To what extent do you feel your responsibility is to bring acute awareness to these important ideas and phenomena that affect us in large and small ways through empathy only? And to what extent do you think a novelist should suggest solutions, whether through implication or just right explicitly, that considers the full spectrum of, say, political ideologies? Because, of what I wish I could say that the pandemic was over and that the upside down nature of what we used to call American democracy was fully righted, but it's not. I think we're still in the maelstrom. The wind is blowing in a different direction, maybe, but I think we're still at sea. So, so the short version of the question is, as a novelist, how can you help us understand this?
Yeah,
and use the power of empathy to get us to understand this.
I don't think that the novel is best used as a polemic. The beauty of storytelling and robust characterization and intriguing plot and lyrical language, the beauty of that, the combination of those elements, is that it can make an abstract thing very visceral, that you can feel in your deepest capacity for affective engagement. You can simply feel the reality of the things being inhabited and personified in a novel. And that is a kind of transformation in consciousness on the part of the reader that's not argued through the story, but it's simply inhabited. It's simply part of the empathetic leap of reading a book. The novel itself becomes that kind of decoded neurofeedback, the kind of exercise in participating in somebody else's thought patterns. But that's usually mostly effectively done by dramatizing the interactions of people and allowing the reader to infer the pain and the fear and the hope and the joy of those characters without, discursively, or didactically describing those things. So, for me, I do want to change the consciousness of my readers. I absolutely do. In that sense, the novel, I believe the novel does have a mission, but it's not accomplished in the way that an argumentative or a sermon might try to accomplish a transformation in consciousness. It's just saying, so here's this dad and this kid, and they're on a camping trip, and the kid spins out, right? and just put the reader into that, immerse him in that affective state, and the change in consciousness will follow.
Wow. So you mentioned that there's some stuff that plays off of the present times. I'm guessing they're more like markers. For example, the astrobiologist's dad is a witness to funding for science research. There's I don't think it spoils the story to say that at one point a massive telescope project gets chopped to pieces in the federal process. And the way you present it is it's somewhat mindless. That is, people aren't really paying attention to the value of that kind of knowledge, but let's just cut the budget for that thing. So that again is to help propel the story along. That is that we allows us to feel the dad and the pain that he gets from the outside world, or are you making a point to remind us about funding for scientific research? Or maybe maybe it's both. I don't know.
Yeah, no, the question has a bearing on the reality, the contract under which this novel unfolds, and I use something like a classic science fiction approach to how to reflect the present. There's a beloved form in science fiction, the near term or the near future speculative fiction, where the world is very much like ours, but some new thing has come in to change the trajectory of the present, and that altered trajectory allows us to kind of consider what the affordances or the possibilities of the present might be. What I do a little differently in this book is to bring that window forward, and I create a novel that's almost like a near present. In other words, a parallel Earth. And the story that you're reading will strongly remind you of the last couple of years that we've lived through. But you'll also be surprised by divergences from the actual geopolitics of this Earth. The Earth on which that story unfolds is just different enough to produce a kind of estrangement effect, so that the reader can't be sure from one page to the next where it might land, what might happen on the outside. And of course, that's a way of making what may be overly familiar to us too quickly because of how saturated we get with information strange again. So that this parallel Earth gives the reader a little place to stand and look back and say, oh, that could have happened in 2019 or 2020, or maybe that did happen and I didn't even notice it. Just to use the not quite story of the not quite Earth to give the reader another take on the actual Earth as they lived through it.
Yeah, and I think to me, the book comes across, well, that might have happened. And on a personal level, I had an interesting eye-opening experience here. So as an African-American, as a kid, we're very much outdoors people, but my family, we didn't choose to go south to the Great Smoky Mountains. Going to, kind of backcountry of Eastern Tennessee or Western North Carolina was not a good thing for Black people to do. The police on the road there. I mean, as a kid, I was taken out to the Grand Canyon and to the Sequoia and many other parts of the national park system. And it was only recently that I found the Great Smoky. And I found the national park in there, which is totally amazing. And you use this as a backdrop, or you use this as a setting for your story. And arguably, this is Well, actually, you should tell me about its ecology, because the bit of time that I got to spend there just totally amazed me. Among other things, is the higher and higher you go, you're in a different place ecologically. The creatures that are there, everything from little fish to bears and everything, and um, and it's so wild, and it's actually not so far from the east, but in my culture, separated from us because of systemic racism that
Yeah.
made it just too risky to go there until relatively recently. Um, so talk to me about the Smokies and
Sure. Well, let me,
why you set this there.
yeah, let me talk about the what makes the Smokies incredible, and then come back with some anecdotal observations about whether or not your experience of the possibility of systemic racism may still be an issue with park visitation. But the Smokies, I moved there 5 years ago because of the overstory. I was
Right.
researching, everything about trees in North America, and was really stunned to learn that upwards of 95% of the old growth forests of the north of in the United States have been logged, and we really only have tiny bits of remnant primary forest, and especially east. Most of the old growth forest in the country is out west. There are very, very few patches up in the east, and that stunned me as an Easterner, as someone who thought he knew what an Eastern forest looked like. I was basically reading, well, you have never seen actually a healthy, fully functional Eastern forest, and to do that, one of the few places that you can go to is the Great Smoky Mountains, because it has the largest contiguous chunks of old growth forest left in the country. It's about 120,000 acres of forest that was never cut, or was cut very, very lightly. I went on a research trip, and it blew me away. I mean, to walk from the recovering forest into the primary forest, into the old growth forest, was like walking from like the Wizard of Oz, going from the black and white film to the color film. It's just from one step to the next. The air changed, the smell changed, the quality of light, and the number of species, and the nature of the forest. And I was overwhelmed with that. I just thought, here's what my country's forests once looked like, and I had no idea. And I was so moved by that I was still thinking about it 8 months later. And I thought, well, that's got to tell you something. And I ended up going back and buying a house and moving. So it's the first time that writing a book ever, changed where I live, and the Smokies is astonishing. They make these wild observations. They say it's the most biodiverse area in the world of its size outside the tropics. There are more species of trees in the Smokies than there are in all of Europe, from the Baltic states to the Iberian Peninsula. There are 1,700 species of flowering plant, 3,000 species of fungus. So it's just this object lesson in biodiversity in a temperate region. If you hike one of these trails in the park, from the bottom of the park to the top of the park, it's like walking from Georgia to Canada. You pass through every kind of forest that the eastern United States has, and that's because you mentioned the elevation changes in the park. The top of the park is almost 7,000 feet, but also solar aspect, and the rain can be very, very varied in the mountains. The glaciers never got down that far, but they drove all the plants and animals in a retreat in front of the glacier up into the Smokies. And when the glaciers retreated, those animals stayed there, and they became these kind of unique island ecosystems. So I feel deeply lucky to have this in my backyard. I can literally step out of my door and walk into the park in a matter of minutes, and I learn something every day. But I do notice this is America's largest terrestrial park east of the Rockies. It is America's most visited national park because it's a day's drive from a huge portion of the population of the country, but it's probably America's whitest park too, still, for reasons that you mentioned, which historically are a bit ironic, since Eastern Tennessee, where I live, was not a slaveholding area, and it was actually pro-union during the Civil War. But it has culturally been absorbed into a part of the world that's just not a comfortable place for people of color to go. I think it's changing a little bit, but it is very noticeable to me that there is.
Yeah, there are not a lot of folk there. There's I don't know if you've been to actually I can't remember the name of it. It's about 2,000 feet. They have an Appalachian club there. This is an old settlement.
Elkmont.
Elkmont, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a display of the people who populated it. This is the Tennessee side. I didn't say that right. Tennessee.
Right.
And this huge gathering of people, all white.
Yeah.
And the park, as you know, was saved when the timber crowd that wanted to have it as a national forest was pushed back in favor of it being a national park, and thanks to the Rockefeller family, actually,
That's
a
right.
lot of money.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
Also there's big public money in it. But you see nothing representing people of color in Elkmont, and actually many other parts of the historic parts of the park. So, oh my goodness! Look at the time. We're having such a good time here. I got a question. We'll wrap up with this question from a listener. Who is your ideal reader?
Oh, someone omnivorously curious, who has a hunger for understanding his or herself, not only as a psychological creature bumping up against other human beings, but as part of all kinds of systems, and who wants to hear and think about and live in stories that try to reconnect the human to all of these larger, smaller stories above, beyond, alongside the human, and bring us back to a living planet, as opposed to one that we've invented out of our private psychologies.
Very cool. Of course, I do have to ask this question, which you probably would prudently not answer, but I have to ask it. You're on this book tour for Bewilderment, but what are you working on right now?
That's a good commodity culture question. What's the next product? And every time I write a book, I increasingly, as I get older, I feel like maybe that's it. I think about the lines from the Tao Te Ching that says, when you've said what you have to say, retire, but I can't really go for very long without starting to invent another story, without using words to kind of think my own way back into clarity or into the next step. So I do have a story underway. It's still in infancy, but it has a lot to do with this feature of modern life, where the machines are beginning to understand our behaviors in very primal and comprehensive ways, and the algorithms are starting to know us better than we know ourselves. So that's just a little hint of what the next story is about.
Oh my, here we go. Here we go. Yeah. And the machines, I mean, the facial recognition software, speaking of institutional racism, has been called out because, gee, it does a lot better with white male faces than it does with
Right.
people with, different genders and different
Right.
ethnic backgrounds.
Right.
So something tells me your machines aren't going to be very well behaved, at least in part.
You need to have drama, Steve. That's what makes a person continue to turn the pages.
So we are all out of time here, and we have to wrap it up there. So just want to say that Richard Powers' new book is called Bewilderment, and thank you so much for taking the time with us tonight.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's a fun conversation.
And well, our pleasure. And big thanks to our co-sponsors, of course, the University of Massachusetts Boston School for the Environment, where we're based, and the UMass Boston McCormick Graduate School, and the Sustainable Solutions Laboratory at UMass. And thank you all for joining us. Now, look, if you have enjoyed tonight's session, if you've enjoyed this free event, please consider supporting what we do here at Living on Earth. You can donate at our website, that's loe.org. We are a listener-supported show, and your contribution will make an impact, whether it's $5 or $500 or $5 million. And just a reminder, don't miss our special thank you for the first 20 folks who pitched in $75 or more tonight, because if you do that, you will receive a signed copy of Bewilderment. So, Richard, before you go to bed, you got to start signing these things. Okay, so they'll be ready. And just want to tell you all that this is the first in a stellar lineup of our fall live interview series. Coming up next is Kanari Webb with her book Guardians of the Trees on October 5th. You detect a bit of a theme here. Be sure to sign up for our newsletter at loe.org to find out about it and all the great events we'll be having in the coming months. So thank you all for joining us, and until next time, goodbye. Thank you again, Richard.
Thanks, Steve. Good night, everyone.